Welcome, everybody. And thank you for being here with us today and joining us for this conversation where we'll be discussing inventory planning, the ins and outs of managing a vital asset. So the goal of this conversation is to hopefully provide some real-world experience and usable advice, and we have the right people to do just that. So my name is Mike Pantaleone. I'm a partner at LLR Partners, a private equity fund based in Philadelphia, and I'll be moderating today's panel. And why don't we say a quick hello to our panelists before we get started.
Hi, I'm Madeline Camejo, Chief Pharmacy Officer for Baptist Health South Florida in Miami.
I'm Rob Hahn. I'm the COO of Pattern. We're located outside Salt Lake City. We're a global marketplace accelerator and a 3PL as well.
Hi, I'm Bob Loycano. I am Vice President of Supply Chain at FDH Aero, based in Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we are a distribution company for airplane parts.
Hi, good afternoon, guys. My name is Corey Weeks. I'm the Vice President of Global Logistics at Canada. We are an outerwear apparel company, and anything that moves or we store around the world, my team, myself are responsible for.
All right. So before we get started, I just want to mention to everybody that you'll see QR codes go up at some point during the conversation, so you can submit questions that you have for the panelists, and we will get to those as we wrap up. So I'll give another reminder about halfway through, but if you have questions, fire up the QR code and submit them, and we'll hopefully get a chance to address all of them. So why don't we get started with a simple but loaded question to get us oriented. And Bob, maybe you can help us with this one to start.
Sure.
Where does inventory sit in your business and why? Who owns it? Does it have a single owner or is it split across various departments? Who are the people that are involved?
Ooh, yeah, love that question. So for us, being a distributor, we have inventory at roughly 13 locations around the globe. We, as a company, we own the inventory, but it's an interesting question in terms of internally who really owns it. We have that battle a lot because as a supply chain guy, we own the input of that inventory, but sales owns the output. And so every month we argue about if we made it or didn't make it, who's going to take credit or who's going to take the fall for what happened in inventory that month. And so we have been going through internally a new program where we are going to own it as a supply chain guys, but we're going to work very, very closely with our sales counterparts to understand what is it that they're predicting, and they understand that from a P&L standpoint, we need them to make their case. Otherwise, we're not going to make our inventory goals. But we are going to own it as a supply chain internal group.
So that's a distributor's point of view,
Yes.
and we have a few different business models up here, and I'm curious how consistent or inconsistent that might be with some of the other panelists.
Yeah, so we're more of a manufacturer and a retailer, global retailer. Right now in my organization, in the planning realm, they own inventory. But there's certainly, a good argument, and we'll talk more about that as we discuss this afternoon, that there's a pretty good case that you can argue supply chain could own aspects of it. Maybe some types of inventory can reside with the planning organization. But currently in my organization and organizations like Canada Goose, you tend to find that inventory resides in the planning realm as opposed to the supply chain realm.
For myself, in the medical field, the pharmacy owns a lot of our drugs and medical supplies in the supply chain. So we have to manage it, make sure that we have everything we need for our patients, including when inventory, especially drugs, go on shortage. There's about 300 drug shortages in the country today. But we have to do a lot of planning, especially when you're looking to help treat patients and make sure that they get what they need for their treatments while they're in the hospital or within our system for care.
I think there's two pieces. There's kind of like maybe a cultural or a strategic part of like who, we've got, tens of thousands of SKUs and we're selling in marketplaces all around the world. Getting the right amount in the right place at the right time is always super challenging. And I think there's pieces where there's a separation a little bit between who is deciding how much we should get and what we should get and how we actually executing moving it around the world, which kind of feels like a different like two different functions, right? But as far as, like we have data scientists and we've got algorithms to tell us what we should be buying and what we should be holding and what's the, opportunity cost and cost of capital doing X, Y, or Z in different places. That is strategically very different from who actually hits the button to buy inventory, right? I actually think that it's a good separation of the people deciding what should be bought and the actual people hitting the button. There's a good, healthy separation there where there's a good, just built-in accountability. So for us, we're constantly thinking about, you've got sales or brand management or however you want to go chase that vendor management where they're like, hey, it's more of like a tops-down kind of thing. I've got these targets, this stuff I'm trying to go hit. And then you've got the people that are like, well, the demand signals aren't there, so I'm not going to go do X, Y, or Z, right? I think that there's actually good, healthy friction between organizations if you can slice it the right way.
I think the magic word there was accountability. So it's going to vary a bit by business model, by what type of company that you're participating in, but having an owner of the inventory process, I think, is the first kind of step in terms of how we're going to approach today's conversation.
I'll give you a real life example. We just had one of our companies, we're a company that has had done many different acquisitions over the years. So one of our largest acquisitions used to always have the sales guys decide what they're going to buy. And they directed that to the actual purchasing people. And we took that over a year ago. They were amazed at how much in control our inventory is now, because you've got that healthy debate internally about what the right answer is in terms of what to go buy.
So for our next question, we'll ask you, Madeline, and this one is a bit more topical. Given the current landscape where it seems like there's a different tariff coming or going almost by the hour, what are some of the things leaders should be thinking about pertaining to their inventory? How do you keep the right strategic considerations?
So for us, I know with China, tariffs is one of the big things the administration is looking at hitting, which is only going to increase drug costs for the United States when China and India make 80% of the drugs world market. So that's going to be very difficult for us in the healthcare system to survive. But one of the things that I started to do back when COVID hit, because a lot of the borders closed, we had huge issues of getting meds into the United States at that point, is we started to look at diversifying and looking at getting other suppliers, not just China or India. We really started to focus on moving other suppliers through Europe, raw materials, and one of the things that our company did was actually began to invest in a company that could make drugs here in the United States. So really looking at when those things happen is where are you going to, if you need to make your raw materials from different parts of the world, then start to align yourself to really diversified who can supply you and be able to then maintain a healthy inventory status for your organization.
Yeah. I think, sorry. All right. Yeah, I think it feels like it accelerated, or it is accelerating a lot of things that I think many manufacturers and brands and whatever companies are thinking about, and they've been working on it for the last few years, like nearshoring. And you think about looking at China. You've got, just reading an article this morning, right? You've got an aging population with something like 300 million people in China are going to be retirement age in the next decade or something like that, right? Like all of the United States, literally the equivalent thereof is going to be retiring in China in the next decade. So you've got this the cost structure is going to change. China is already heading that direction, right? So you've had lots of different companies that have said, hey, I need to think about diversifying. I need to get into a different area. Even big companies, right? You saw a move from Apple moving away from just manufacturing in traditional areas. So I think that it has been happening for a while. And now it's a question of, okay, what tariffs are going to land? What are not going to? What are going to sustain? But I think the question is that you manufacture in China and you ship it to the US, that kind of, I think it's been shifting for a while. I don't think that's a brand new thing. It just kind of pulls it to the front.
Yeah, I was just actually going to echo what we just mentioned. There was a lot of talk about the China plus one strategy, right? Plus one being most likely in Southeast Asia still, Vietnam, for example. But what we're seeing with tariffs, and this is actually the design of tariffs, is you want to, as a strategy, look at a lot more nearshoring, friendshoring, because the shorter you can shrink that time that you have that inventory or that capital tied up, the less risk you have, the less chance of exposure, the less chance of impact on tariffs or impact of tariffs and so on. So the more you can shorten that value chain, and you would tend to get that shortened by nearshoring or sourcing a lot closer to home, you are exposing yourself to a lot less risk. So as a strategy from a supply chain standpoint, you want to really look at how can you shorten that value chain. So instead of a China plus one being that plus one in Southeast Asia, bring that sourcing a lot closer to home, and it solves a lot more problems than it could create.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to jump back. I mean, COVID, I think maybe the only good thing that came from COVID. Am I allowed to say that?
You can say that.
Too soon? Is that people really saw the value and the requirement of having a really solid supply chain. So I think when you have something really concentrated, they're like, okay, we actually could do this a slightly different way and reduce our risk, not from necessarily like a global pandemic, but for lots of other reasons, right? So I think it kind of, again, like it was, a pretty massive event that happened, obviously, but it just showed the value of understanding what actually, instead of this traditional model that we're so used to, like that's what you do. I think that is another big thing that has driven people toward, okay, what is the right thing for my company? Like, am I the right, does it make sense to do it in Mexico, or is it wherever that might be, right? So I think that this is just the next evolution.
From our distribution standpoint, and especially in aerospace, we don't buy a lot of parts from China, but this latest tariff of raw materials is definitely going to hit us. Especially from stainless steels. We use a lot of stainless steel in airplanes. So two strategies that we have. One is we've stratified all of our parts. So when you look at your A parts, those running high velocity, high value parts, you're going to go buffer those. You have to, because you have to protect yourself and your customers. But the other thing we're doing is we're reaching down into our manufacturing supply chain and understanding what are they doing. And a lot of them are doing the same thing. They're buffering those raw materials because that's where the lead time is. A lot of the lead times on airplane parts are over a year long. So and it's because of the raw materials. So if they can go buffer that, it just helps themselves and their customers.
So if accountability was the magic word from the first question, I feel like resiliency is kind of the big takeaway item from your responses there. So the big strategic angle, accountability, resiliency being two core themes for people to be thinking about. And before we jump to the next prompt, I just want to remind folks again, we have put the QR codes up on the screens. If you have questions for the panelists that you'd like us to address towards the end, please submit them and we'll try to get everybody's in. But shifting from that strategy to tactical, what are the action plans? Corey, maybe you can help us lead here. What are the tactical considerations? How do you put these strategies into action to do inventory management well?
Yeah, I'll merge that. It's a really good question. I'll merge that question with AI. Some of you might not have heard of AI. It hasn't been mentioned at least a dozen times so far. But some things that you can do tactically, is definitely well documented. And it goes back to the question of, there are two questions. Who has the responsibility for buying that inventory? And then who has the responsibility for ensuring that it's distributed as best as possible? Now, I'll look at the tactical piece in terms of the distribution aspect. There's enough of predictive analytics, AI tools, enough software out there that we've seen that we can unlock millions of dollars in our network in sharper, much better flow to ensure that inventory is in the right place at the right time for the right customer. That doesn't need to be human managed. We've set up systems that allow for the analysis to be done, and after that analysis is done, it automatically provides the output to our replenishment system, so you can think about autonomous or automatic replenishment. You can do that for a good portion of your inventory. There's got to be a good 30, 40, 50% of your inventory. You've got stable demand, pretty good forecast algorithms that allow you to put mathematics and logic around the replenishment of that inventory. And it does a way better job than a human ever would. I mean, especially when you're talking about tens of thousands of SKUs across tens of selling points. There's no way a human person could be able to crunch those numbers as effectively and as continuously as the AI tools would allow you to do. So from a practical standpoint, we've seen a lot of unlock in that distribution to flow inventory in a way that supports the business and actually drives revenue. That doesn't answer the question on how much to buy. There's still a bit of a debate on that. But certainly in terms of replenishment on that 40-50% of inventory, we've seen that tactical step has unlocked millions of dollars.
Yeah, and I mean, from a distributor's standpoint, we have over 500,000 SKUs that we need to try to manage. And when I think about, how do you do that? You really can't do that as a human. We have to look for ways of doing some type of automation to be able to manage that. And in the end, what you want to end up doing is only managing the exceptions. And so when we try to manage our supply base with all those items coming in, and when they're coming in, and then match that to the sales orders on the other side and when they're going to end up shipping out, right? But it really takes some type of system to do that. We just can't do it by humans. We have humans in the group, and they help, but you got to manage that some other way.
Yeah, I think for us, from a medication perspective, we actually centralized our buying. And before, we used to have a buyer at each of our hospitals, each of the areas trying to buy. Inventory was wasted. Some things expired in some hospitals that didn't. So one of the strategies we did about 3 years ago was centralized our central distribution, where we bought everything for the hospitals and distributed out that way and kept track of everything. Today, now with a lot of the software, we're able to see when a hospital isn't using a certain medication, we can move it to another hospital so that it is not expired. But I mean, we would waste a lot of medications, and it's an issue that happens a lot within the healthcare system if you don't manage inventory. You can't do it one person like we used to. It's really now with AI, analytics, all this software and inventory things that are out there that really helps us improve our inventory management.
Go ahead, Corey. Yeah. Give the thumbs up.
A couple of quick follow-ups. The tools exist. One challenge that you want to go into a change like this, eyes wide open, is you're going to get a lot of cultural, not necessarily pushback, but you want to look at that aspect, because depending on who owns inventory right now, convincing folks that the electrons are going to do a much better job than folks who've done it for 5, 10, 15 years, that's going to be an internal cultural battle. So you want to be prepared for that. So the other thing that I'll leave you guys with is the tools exist, but be careful in terms of what tools you look at. There's a lot of software that's been built on platforms that have been around for 25, 30 years. Those aren't the tools that are going to take you into the future. There are a lot of no-code, low-code tools out there, probably a little bit lesser known, flying under the radar. So you want to be very creative and want to be very open-minded in terms of how are you going to solve that problem, and not necessarily be sold by some of the bigger brand software companies that have been around for 25 to 30 years. Wouldn't call any names, but there are quite a few out there that you probably want to stay away from. Yeah,
I think there's maybe a couple different if I first think about the ability to, if you zoom out and how do I get the right inventory at the right place? I don't know if anyone in the room has ever had the inventory in the wrong place. I don't know, ever? No? Okay, I'm the only one? Awesome. It happens all the time, right? It's a very common thing where you end up getting stranded. So I think there's been a push, for a while there in the kind of the retail space, if you have a Shopify brand, or, you kind of get these things out there where hey, I've got 55 different warehouses. I can get really close to your customer. That's true for a marketplace, like an Amazon or a Walmart, definitely, something that has interest. But if you're a normal seller, you don't need to be in 55 places, right? You reduce down, same problem you're talking about. You end up spreading your inventory in so many places, it becomes significantly less fungible and flexible. And so I think a couple things, when you think about WMSs and where we've kind of come, there's a lot of focus, and there needs to be a lot of focus on how you really think of powering an omni-channel solution, for example, for a retail brand. You have to think about physically where am I having this stuff, and then do I have the logistics and operations to unlock the ability to do 1P drop ship for Walmart, for example? Or do you have, that's all driven by your ability to keep inventory and also matched with your ability in a WMS or something like that to work, right? I think that's such a critical piece. And then it's kind of the second, I think, about the software, like, I guess more back to the original question here, is like, forecasting is always wrong, right? Like that's the only thing that's true about forecasting. Every single time it's wrong. It's really about how wrong are you and how quickly can you respond and react to being wrong. And so it requires different for like probably something different maybe for you or for you than we're in more like a retail environment where we're sitting here like I'm buying and selling stuff on global e-commerce. And so we to think about how do I get to the point where I have human beings and really, really intelligent software, right? And like that's grown, like homegrown by us. Most software out there is like, it's just Excel, right? Like that's actually what most inventory management like I give this advice to people all the time. If you're not gonna build something super interesting, just use it, like learn some formulas. Excel does a lot of hard work. I have a little, I don't know, there's probably no Amazon people. I worked for Amazon for a long time. And I went to this conference and one of my favorite things, so this guy stands up there, talks about all this really cool, incredibly awesome logic. And they were like, all right, so what happens next? And he's like, we go in, we grab trillions of points of data, and we do all this stuff. And he's like, and then it spits out into Excel. And I was like, what? This is crazy. Like, I don't think that's true anymore. I'm sorry. I'm not like, but like this is probably 7 or 8 years ago now. And like still, even at that company, at that scale, like the output still popped into Excel so somebody could manipulate it. There's been a lot of work done around inventory planning, but at the end of the day, it's still your inputs and your outputs. And a lot of that can be done with either a no cost or a very low cost model for the vast majority of situations that people find themselves in.
So there's a couple questions that have come in from the audience, and we appreciate that. The QR code should pop back up at some point here, but they're relevant to this strand. So we're going to go a little out of order and pop a couple of the questions from the group for the panel to consider. So these are net new, so anybody can jump in. But I like this one. What is your partnership with your IT and data organization on inventory? Does IT and data also need to own inventory in some capacity?
Okay, I'll go first because this probably will be maybe a little bit controversial. I don't think anyone from IT is in here. I don't think so. All right, so there's several things. And this is not meant that everyone has to copy this approach, but we have our own data team. Several reasons. IT has corporate responsibility. My focus may not be their focus. They've got a number of other things that they've got to prioritize. So when we want to move with agility and when we want to move very quickly, we can't be number 17 or number 18 on IT's priority list to get a small thing done. So we've actually got our own IT internal supply chain IT team. They're obviously governed by the corporate IT team, but that allows us to move faster to implement no-code, low-code approaches to move inventory and to solve logistics problems in a way that is a lot faster than waiting on traditional corporate IT. So we found, and this is the second place that I've taken that approach that I found works, because the pace of our business, things are changing, you've got tariffs. We've got to solve problems in a very, very agile and quick manner. And I find that corporate IT departments, yes, they're necessary, but they're too slow when it comes to being on the pulse of what's happening and being able to move very, very quickly. So that approach I find is workable. So if you're considering or you're banging your head on the table as to why IT is so slow, maybe get your own sub-IT department, just saying.
I'm actually living this right now with my IT team. And it's I wouldn't even say it's humorous, it's not. But what we're doing is they want us to use the software that they want to do in terms of inventory management. For example, using the ERP system that we have in place and letting that do inventory management. And I'm arguing with them, no, that's a terrible idea because it doesn't do A, B, C, D, E on a whole bunch of other things. But there's collaboration there. Well, I will say it's a little bit of a guarded collaboration, but there is collaboration because at the end of the day, I am their internal customer. And I am using that card because I know that we have to have a better solution than what they are offering to do inventory management. There are better solutions out there, right? Other software out there that does what we needed to do. I'd need them to understand that, yes, that is what we need, not this proposal that you have.
Yeah, I agree. We did the same thing, Corey. Our pharmacy team, because we manage inventory, we've actually have our own pharmacist informaticist, and they work with the corporate IT team for system integration and other things that may need to incorporate into our electronic health records. But other than that, it's really, they don't understand the business and they don't understand the needs that we do need. So having that own team who are actually pharmacists as well and understand what we need to do from medication management perspective has really been able to move at lightning speed versus trying to explain, because that's how we kind of started trying to explain how management of these inventory works was too long. So we just created our own team, and that really helped integrate and move us quicker.
One last point. If your IT team tells you to use your ERP system is not your supply operation system, okay? So if you get that from your IT team, go on Amazon, buy ERP systems are not supply chain operation system t-shirt, and wear it into the office.
Yeah, I mean, at our core, Pattern is a tech company. At the end of the day, we have hundreds and hundreds of developers. We built all of our own software, from anything from like ad bidding all the way through inventory management, through our WMS and our OMS. So we did something it's actually quite encouraging to hear the decentralized. So I actually broke the entire product and tech organizations up. And so they're completely decentralized. Because as you continue to scale up, I mean, a couple times like a central IT team, the problem with the central IT team is it's going to be slow no matter what. And so we actually broke the entire thing. So I've got product and tech leaders reporting up through each individual organization trying to chase that specific problem. It kind of just takes the cap off. Yeah, there's things you need to manage and things you need to watch out for, but the benefits severely outweigh the costs there. Like the pros outweigh the cons. I mean, what you end up getting to, and there's no like, I'm relying on them then, like them is us, right? So we end up we're solving the same problem. So it allows us really to be like, all right, we as a team are trying to go chase this, and it just takes away the friction of like, I want you to use the tool. We're like, well, we all have the same goal. So it's been a very, very positive thing. We've, about 18 months in of doing that thing, and it's been a very positive, challenging change, but it's way, way, way better.
So Rob, you mentioned Excel in an earlier response, and another question we've had come in that relates to this thread is, when looking to optimize your planning process, did you decide to use third-party software, hopefully not ERP, right, Corey, or to build an in-house model? Why did you lean one way or the other?
I've talked a lot, so I'll keep mine short. A lot of this software is built for everyone, so it's built for no one. And that's really what it ends up being, right? It's not customizable. It's not actually going to solve your specific problem, which is why I just think a lot of those solutions are really good for maybe starting out or very small. But if you are doing anything sophisticated or complex, use Excel, or you got to build something to actually invest in doing something your own.
Yeah, definitely echo that. As I said, a lot of software out there, the architecture is built on is decades behind. Where I've found the most success and continue to find success is, you can't get everything from your ERP, but your ERP is an input into a suite of tools that you build internally with good IT people. So you get extracts from ERP, from WMS, from TMS, from CRM, from all different types of systems to put together the picture that you and your team have come up with, that, you know what, I want to see these metrics. These metrics mean I want to measure ABC. ABC comes from these different sources. So I pull those sources into the dashboard that I want, that allows me to be able to see the issues that I want to see, and then to also take action. So when you're solving problems like that, that tends to be, you have to do that internally. It's your problem, what's the problem, what is the solution, and then what is the technology that we need for me to be able to continually solve that problem. That tends to be internal development, but it's internal development using existing no-code, low-code tools to pull from existing systems. So it's not that you don't use any of the existing systems, but you've got to stitch that together yourselves, I find, with an internal department.
Okay. So we'll move on to the last prepared prompt. And Rob, I know you're a little tired of talking, but we're going to pick on you again. You mentioned what we learned from COVID. I think one of the things that we all had to face at some point was, what do you do when you're wrong? It happens. So when the proverbial you know what hits the fan, where do you start?
Yeah, I think that this is probably unique for, I mean, it's easy to say it's unique for everybody, but I think one of the major things, I'm going to start with what you don't do. And what I think a lot of brands did, for example, a lot of manufacturers or CPGs or whatever at that time ended up saying, I have a bunch of extra stuff and I'm going to, throw it out the back of the truck kind of situation, right? Like, you want it, I'll, fire sale. I just want to get rid of it. And they think that hitting that, either getting rid of the inventory or hitting that top line sale number in the short term is a better solution. But we obviously spend a lot of time talking about marketplaces, and the reality is, like, pricing has changed in such a dramatic way across marketplaces. In a scenario like, I don't know how many people in the room actually sell a thing, but if you sell on Amazon, you sell on Target, for example, or even in a physical store in Target, you've got a foundational change in the way that these marketplaces interact. Amazon is looking at physical pricing and online pricing and saying, you actually don't have what's called the buy box, right? Like, if you go on Amazon, you're like, the add to cart, like that default thing, that dies and goes away if you're not price competitive anymore. So a lot of these brands ended up saying, okay, I just got to get rid of this shit. And then you're sitting here like, oh, well, great, cool. I'm sitting here, I get the dollar amount and I've got the inventory off the books and I've opened up the pallet spaces. And then you sit here and you're like, oh, well, great. Now my stuff is actually on sale over here and I've lost the buy box on Amazon, or Target is yelling at me because I've got something over here also at the same price. So what you can't do is just throw it out the back, right? And try to do that. So I think that what you end up needing to do is think about what your price integrity is across the board and try to figure out what solution is best. I think in general, there are a lot of ways to get rid of excess inventory. Expiration dated goods, right? Like stuff is a totally different problem. But there are times, unfortunately, where letting something die and rot is actually the right solution for the overall either brand or overall integrity of that product, which feels very, very bad sometimes. So you really need to take a look at each individual situation and understand the 4 or 5 layers deep of what's going to happen if I have too much of that inventory, right? So I think that's a big one. The other thing, a lot of people get really nervous if you're our manufacturer to say, hey, it's flow, right? I don't want to slow down. And sometimes you just got to hit the big red button and stop. And that's a really hard thing to do, especially if you're more vertically integrated and you've got an ops person downstream saying, well, I need to hit my numbers too. Sometimes you just got to stop, which is a very, very challenging thing to get people to agree to do.
Yeah, just to go back to your question, so what to do when your forecast is wrong? Well, the first thing you do is you blame sales and then you reply all to the last email. So that's the first thing you do.
That's the end of the answer, actually. That was good.
There you go. What we've seen, so it goes back to the point of your point, forecasts are always going to be wrong. So what we're looking at now, we're not there yet, but it's optionality and resilience. So if your forecast for a particular item at this selling location is wrong, well, does that mean that you lose the sale, or can you get that customer still satisfied from another location? Can you drop ship from another location? Can you, instead of shipping from the warehouse to refill, that might be too long, can you get a nearby store, ship to customer, or can you transfer to the store? So by looking at, if the forecast is wrong, what are the options that we have on the table to still satisfy the order? And then building some rules around that, so that rather than finding out that, the forecast is wrong and 3 days from now or 3 days later, we could have satisfied our order because the other store had inventory, building that logic as much as possible so that if you are out of stock, there's an automatic replenishment process that, at that level of sale or that price point, it's worth it to transfer from store, the customer's still happy. So by looking at what happens when it doesn't work and what are the options you have in your supply chain, you can still try to salvage that sale as much as possible. So I'll go back to optionality and looking at resilience for when the forecast is wrong could be a way that you still capture revenue.
I'll talk about what we did. We actually changed what we measure. And I'll say it this way, because when we had companies that were basically dominated by sales and they decided every decision in the company, well, guess what? One of their measurements was what was their margin on the sale. And when that would happen, instead of buying 100 pieces like the customer wanted, they'll buy 10,000 pieces because they got a really low unit price, and so they got a really great margin, and they all rewarded themselves. And here we are years later trying to figure out what we do with the other 9,900 parts that we bought and are still sitting in stock. And the finance guys want to, write them off. So we changed how we measure it. And so looking at margin only is not something we'll do going forward because it's the wrong way to just measure it.
I'm going to call it, I actually love what you're talking about. You were proactive. You're starting to measure it, right? And you're like, that fungibility of inventory, either in the location you've got, the ability to connect, or systems that can say, hey, I've got demand over here and I've got physical goods over here. A lot of people end up storing inventory as like, this is SKU 1 and this is SKU 2, and it's actually the same foundationally the same thing. I've got e-com packaging, I've got retail packaging, right? You've got these very practical problems that people are trying to solve in other ways that have negative effects there. But if you have the ability to proactively see and transfer something, like I was like, yeah, that's exactly, we try to do the same thing, but it's like, it's really hard to do and set up. But if you can do that, having that inventory to be able to be flexible and fungible is like very easy to say. We're like, of course, that's a great idea. It's super hard to do in real life. But you just said that, and I was like, what, that's actually, I was hoping you would, tell them, I was hoping you'd say more about that, because like, that's actually a really interesting problem.
No, we actually do. In order for us to manage our inventories, we have smaller hospitals that may have different types of patients that they're seeing versus our large hospitals, over 1,200 beds, which sees the most complicated we have. So heart medications may not be as complicated at the smaller hospital, so we end up moving inventory within the system, which is so much easier to do than having the one hospital over by. The other thing that for us with drug shortages, when we have a severe drug shortage of a particular med, especially if remember during COVID where critical care meds were on a shortage and we centralized that and we kept really tight inventories on making sure we always had it. And what we actually did was then had our smaller hospitals buy larger inventory than what they normally did. And then we would transfer it within to keep everyone within the system whole.
Am I allowed to ask a question? I feel like I'm stealing your job here.
Please.
Did you end up doing do you end up having a central place where you hold stuff that's more, do you end up holding some and then distributing smaller amounts as well?
Yeah, we ended up building a central distribution.
What did you find that was, I'm sorry, I'm actually just really curious. What did you end up doing as you end up getting stuff in the central warehouse, which is good. Are you doing a lot smaller, more frequent? How do you balance that with like transportation costs versus holding costs versus obsolescence? Like how are you thinking about that?
So one of the things we did was we actually partnered with our other central distribution, which is supply chain, which just does the more of the all the products like the medical supply side. And so we use the same trucks. So we pick everything up in the morning, we send it to their trucks, and then their trucks go out. We have only a couple of trucks if we have to go out of our way to help other hospitals, or if there's any emergency need for a medication, then we do that. But we try to leverage our own logistics within our system as much as possible. And we also then end up having, in situations where we needed to get things out quicker, then we would take out a third party where we could use them as carriers if we needed that.
So I'm going to try to combine a couple of the questions that have come in as we start to wrap up here. And if we acknowledge that the forecast is always going to be wrong, then it sounds like preventing very wrong is a key element of the job. And I imagine that data plays a real part in that. There's a saying, garbage in, garbage out, for a reason, and I think that these questions are kind of poking at that. So what types of data samples or data quality, how do you ensure some sort of baseline when you are getting started to make sure that you don't end up in a situation where it's garbage in, garbage out, and you're not able to anticipate things like seasonality or wild customer demand variances?
Yeah, one thing I'll mention then, the other panelists can chime in, is that a lot of forecasting, you're taught, it really is time series based. So, moving averages or exponential smoothing, a lot of forecasting is based on those methodologies. But a lot of what happens, especially if you're in a consumer-facing business, there are a lot more drivers impacting real demand today than it was in the stable years 10, 15 years ago, where time series forecasting would have worked. So because you've got a lot more different drivers and so on today than, let's say, 10, 15 years ago, you want to start to look beyond the traditional forecasting methods and start looking at what we call like causality forecasting. What drivers of the market might be influenced by another factor? It could be temperature, it could be weather, it could be demographics. So by starting to look at other ways of what is driving your demand, you might actually see sharper relationships that allow you for more accurate forecasting using those models. So we found, I'm in a business where it's very dependent on weather, temperature. I can almost predict to a degree, literally when the temperature is 2 degrees, whatever below normal, we know what that is going to be in terms of sales. So if I were to just look at a mathematical, time series historical trend, I would miss that. When I know that that's that 2 degree drop, I can link that to behavior. So sometimes looking for those relationships in a slightly different way would actually allow you to to forecast more accurately than the traditional way. So that's one thing that you can look at to try to improve your forecasting.
One of the things we did too, just to talk about when we first started to go into an automated response of sending meds and everything else, we created in our process what we call cycle counts. And so every day at night, throughout the night, there would be certain medications that would pop up that we would make people count at the different locations to verify that at the end, we actually had what was actually in the machine. So having that accuracy was something we did, even though they hated doing it, but it really then trusted the system to make sure if the inventory said there was 100, there was 100.
Any other closing thoughts?
I think that when you think about data, I think that there's kind of two pieces. I think we all kind of pride ourselves on being able to see the future, but generally, you have to be able to, you're going to mess up a few times. I think it's super important to study the past when you are thinking about how do I identify where I'm going to see a gap or going to see where we were wrong. Like when we go back and say what has happened, obviously the past is best indicator of future, right? That's an obvious thing. But the categorization of what happened and why is extremely hard. I think probably when we talk about AI, which everybody talks about, I think AI can do in some areas probably a lot more than we think. And they're probably more of the unsexy areas than you might imagine. But where it's actually very, very, very good is categorization. So I think if there's anything to say like, what has happened and why has it happened? And if you're gonna point something around this world saying, hey, why did it, linking sales to certain degrees, certain temperatures in certain areas, stuff like that, that you can help categorize that information because then you can do something with it. So I think a lot of people end up saying, forgetting that categorization of what actually happened and the root cause of that actually leads to a significant ability to predict the future. You have to be able to do that.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that. Inventory planning is not an exact science. It's just not, right? So when you have errors, when you make mistakes, you need to learn from them, and let's figure out what is it that we are going to do different next time so we have a different result.
All right. Well, I want to just say thank you to our great panel for our insightful conversation and a lot of great topics that were covered, and thank everybody for joining us for today's conversation. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of the Manifest Conference.